Hafaday, and welcome to this series about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. These episodes introduce the latest research and discussions about ancient life, history, and cultural traditions all across our diverse region of Micronesia. I hope that you like this series, and I look forward to learning more together. Toward learning about traditional healing and heal ways in Guam and the Mariana Islands, Matilda Carbajo shares about her studies in a historical perspective.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for letting me share my research or some of it with you today. I am interested in the relationship between colonialism and medicine, and more precisely about these two in the Mariana Islands with a historical perspective. This topic has been addressed before, but with a special focus on the history of Guam after 1898. On the screen, you can see two very important and foundational research volumes on this topic. I want to look back into the past with the same idea, because the roots of colonialism and medicine in the archipelago go back to 1668, when a religious order, the Society of Jesus, founded a Catholic mission on the islands. And to do this, I have introduced the concept of healways, which refers to the material conditions, practices, and ideas surrounding curing, caring, health, and disease. To set the stage, let's go back to 1668. As I said, in this year, the Society of Jesus established a religious mission in the archipelago with the aim of converting the Chamorro, the indigenous inhabitants of the islands. This was the start of the colonization of the Mariana Islands and also of the anti-colonial resistance. So violence escalated in what traditional historiography refers to as the Spanish Chamorro Wars or conflicts. These conflicts persisted until the 1700s, more or less, coinciding with the forced concentration of Chamorro communities into fewer villages known as reducciones, mainly in the islands of Guahan or Guam and Luta or Rota, towards the end of the 17th century. From then on, colonial administration will be centered in Hagaña, in the island of Guahan, and this town served also as the center for the religious administration, so for the Jesuit administration, until the expulsion of the Society of Jesus from the archipelago in 1769, around 100 years later, right? After around the 1700s, a new system of labor was established, along with a new way of being. So these are depicted on the screen by images of Chamorro children walking in disciplined processions and these Chamorro farmers working in the fields. It is this period, roughly spanning the 18th century, that is the focus of our attention here. Just a very, very quick methodological remark. The sources that I've used include religious official reports and also more personal letters that they sent to their superiors, family, relatives in the Americas or Europe, also the Philippines. Also documents from the colonial administration, including letters between civil authorities in the Marianas and those in the Philippines and the Americas, also in Spain. And also inventories of provision, detailing the woods, the elements, and the objects that arrived into the Marianas or that were requested. Edited sources like hagiographies and manuals for parish priests also have rich information, and these are a very special type of source because they were edited at the time, and so they circulated a lot. They were very well known at that time. So whatever is in those edited sources, we can assume that it was known at the time, while the other manuscript documents contain more private information. Let's start with the first years of the mission. The group arriving in the Marianas came from various corners of the Spanish Empire and Europe, and they arrived for the most part on a very poor state of health. They were unfamiliar with the local, rich, biodiverse territory of the Marianas, and they lacked the basic care networks and access to medical supplies that for them were essential. And they were well aware of that. So, for instance, the founder of the mission, Diego Luis de San Vitores, emphasized in this need in a very early letter requesting resources for the trip and the initial days on land. And he specifically requested remedies and medical supplies in order not to be dependent on the Temuru since the very beginning. However, the colonists also utilized local products and indigenous medicine. Arguably, they even directly contacted indigenous healing experts. However, in their reports, these exchanges are rarely acknowledged. The use of Temuru medicine by the missionaries is mentioned indirectly and clearly, and or by attributing the effectiveness of the remedies to the healing powers or of the Virgin Mary and the saints or God. As an example, I have this fragment in which Father Luis de Medina, another missioner in the Marianas, acknowledges being healed by Temuru medicine, but credits his recovery to God, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the saints, precisely St. Ignatius, emphasizing their divine intervention in his healing process. While colonizers were using Temuru medicine, although not recognizing this use or kind of disdaining it, in part or completely because this medical tradition was tied to indigenous spiritualities, which they did not appreciate. Colonial agents also tried to reproduce the Eurocentric or colonial healways that they knew and trusted. So these required importing remedies from Europe and especially the Americas, also some Asian ones, along with various healing artifacts, which includes religious items that they use in their healing rituals, if you want. Imported elements included medical waters, medicinal oils and ointments, and a lot of sugar and honey-based remedies. Also medical herbs such as lavender and rosemary, which are of Mediterranean origin, and tobacco. They also brought some tools, so surgical kits, dressings, suction cups, syringes, along with foods and everyday items used in medical recipes or diets, so for example, chicken. Also, containers for storing ointments and substances were sourced for diverse materials and origins. In the accounts, they mention having cedar boxes, earthenware pots from the Philippines, and brass bowls from European medical traditions. Missionaries in the Marianas wanted to secure these healing substances and material culture that were part of this colonial healways that was brought to the islands, but they also needed to replicate the institutions where all of those things were put to use. These institutions, medical institutions in the colonial world generally, two main ones, the hospital and the apothecary. The hospital is not exactly as a hospital as we understand it today. It's more a hospitality-like institution related to charity and charitable activities. And the apothecary was something like the great-grandparent of today's pharmacy. These two medical facilities were usually located near the religious and civil centers of administration in urban contexts or in more rural areas along the major roads. In indigenous territories, they served as platforms for evangelization, and they were for the most part managed by the religious orders. And what is interesting here is that the Society of Jesus often favored the apothecary, while the hospitals were usually run by other orders, which are called nursing orders, like the Franciscans or the Augustinians. So in the Mariana Islands, what is prioritized is the apothecary. The priests locate below their house in Hagaña, in a basement, so next to the church, schools, the garrison, so in the island of Guam. So this space, this basement, was initially used as a hospital, although it was an apothecary for the most part mainly. Later, a designated space was built to treat the sick soldiers of the garrison until they could be sent to the Philippines. You can see on the screen the chronology of reports that tell a little bit about this story. The Marianas Hospital was always an unofficial hospital, kind of a field hospital, and not an officially founded institution. These sheltering sick people in the basement, so in this subterranean space, departs hugely from the elevated Lari Temoro architectural style. So you remember the Lari sets. So this highlights a disparity in the concept of being protection or shelter between the colonizers and the indigenous population, and also a disparity in the knowledge of the local, natural, and environmental conditions. For instance, in one of his reports, one of the missionaries, Francisco Solano, described that a very severe storm, so a typhoon, affected the island of Guam a lot, and it made the house of the Jesuit in Hagåtña collapsed. And so because the sick people were placed in this basement, they got trapped. And he adds that the rain and the wind makes everything flooded and everything turns into a swamp. Despite this, what could have been this very traumatic experience, the practice of subterranean construction persisted, so reflecting this foreign approach to housing. It was in this basement that the priests stored their medicines also. This was the apothecary, as I've mentioned. Inside, several elements were stored, so they had religious artifacts and furnishings, many crafted from woods from the Philippines. Metal instruments were also present, mainly made out of copper, so such as measuring scales, mortars, and pestles, some with their handles. Syringes and kitchenware like pots and mugs were very important also. They also had glass containers and other glass tools, such as various types of bottles and glass jars, as well as different ceramic forms, like jugs, so tibores and tinajuelas, were also included. They also mention Bournay jars, glazed. And this is interesting because Bournay jars are a type of pottery that could be locally produced in the Philippines, but is of Chinese origin. And they also mention having a lot of porcelain pieces that they refer to as China. Regarding remedies, the inventory do not give many specifics, but they talk about various simple medicine, compound or more complex medicines like poultices and other preparations. It is also mentioned that the priests were receiving a yearly payment that the garrison was sending to them in exchange for the medicines of that year. How do we know all this? All of this is reflected on an inventory that is drafted when the Society of Jesus is expelled from the territories of the Spanish crown. So the royal ordinances forced the priest to move out of the territories of the crown, and all of the property that they were holding is transferred to different institutions. And to regulate all of this process, inventories are drafted. These royal ordinances required apothecaries to be transferred to hospitals. But since there was no official hospital in the Marianas, all of these items that I just mentioned were sold publicly to inhabitants of the Mariana Islands. And on screen, you can see a list of the buyers, which include some local and Chamorro surnames that you might recognize. I wanted to highlight this figure of Luis de Taingatongo. When the priests are expelled, the governor of the Marianas, in accordance with the royal instructions, entrusts the management of the pharmacy or the apothecary to an individual who clearly must have been competent and knowledgeable in medicine and pharmacy. And this person is Luis de Taingatongo, whom we can assume to be Chamorro based on his surname. However, in the accounts, Taingatongo is described as somewhat intelligent lad, but we know he must have been highly competent as he eventually became the garrison's apothecary. Just to conclude and to sum up briefly, colonial agents sought to extend colonial hillways in the islands by importing products and material culture that were familiar to them. Colonists used local and indigenous medicine, often attributing efficacy to religious beliefs. I'd like to highlight the conceptual contrast with Lari Chamorro hillways. Colonial hillways are greatly associated with accumulation, preservation, and transportation of remedies, hence the abundance of containers, unlike Chamorro hillways, which rely on an immediate relationship with the environment. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in learning about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. If you would like to learn more details, then I encourage you to visit, in person or online, the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam. Thank you again for watching this program. I hope that you will continue to explore and discover more.